Now this week you will, after a long time, publish your plans for staffing in the NHS over the long term, that workforce plan as it's described. Now we've seen a draft of that plan that says essentially that you need to double the number of training places for doctors and nurses. Is that what you're going to do?
Well, at the beginning of the year, I set out 5 priorities for the country. One of them was to cut waiting lists, and that's why shortly after becoming Prime Minister, we injected more money into the NHS, record funding, in fact, to help the NHS do that. But I also want to make sure that the NHS is modernised and it's fit for the future, and that's why we're going to do things differently. And this week, we're going to do something that no government has ever done. It's going to be one of the most significant announcements in the history of the NHS, and that is to make sure that it has a long-term workforce plan so that we can hire the doctors, nurses and GPs that we need, not just today, but for years into the future, to provide the care that we all need.
So what
the announcement will almost certainly be more private involvement and more spaces for training new doctors and nurses. But of course, you can't just force doctors and nurses to take on the education to get into the healthcare sector to become workforce in the NHS, right? You can't just force them to do these things. You need to be able to attract them to do that, unless you're going to actually guarantee these sector workers a pay rise to be able to attract them into the workforce. Whereas at the moment, if you can make more money working in Pret than you could do as a junior doctor, why the f would you get into it in the first place? Especially when the education is expensive and there's no nurses' bursaries or anything like that to be able to help with the financial costs of getting into the industry in the first place. Before we even think about the fact that the wages have been continually depressed for the last 15 years. Like, this idea that you just open up the spaces and people will magically fill them is just nonsense. It's complete nonsense. Yeah, it literally is governing by field of dreams. If you open the spaces, they will come. And I just like, this is our government. And not just this government as well. It's not just our government. It's the potential new government too. They're going to have a workforce expansion program for the NHS, which it doesn't involve proper pay rises to attract people into the positions in the first place.
But when will ordinary patients see a difference? Because, you know, it takes 7 years to train a doctor, 3 years to train a nurse. So again, you know, if I'm an ordinary patient, when will I see a difference?
Well, so I think we should separate into the short term and the long term. I'm Prime Minister that wants to make a difference today, and that's why cutting waiting lists is one of my 5 priorities, and people can already see that difference. Last year,
then we're not seeing the difference because the waiting lists have gone up.
Practically eliminated the number of people waiting 2 years for treatment. Recently, we've virtually eliminated the number of people waiting 1.5 years. If you look at ambulance response times, A&E waiting times, they've improved considerably from Christmas when they were particularly challenging. But you're right, it's also we take the long-term decisions for the years into the future.
You say that what you're doing on waiting lists is already working. In actual fact, the overall number of people waiting is the highest that it has ever been. Targets on routine waiting.
Laura Kuenssberg has pulled up a Conservative politician for lying. What parallel universe have I quantum leaped into? What's going on?
Waiting lists have been missed. Targets on cancer care have been missed. You can pick some selective statistics, but overall, the experience that people are having on waiting lists is dreadful in many cases.
It's because we've had a pandemic, Laura, and the backlog that ensued was always going to take some time to work through.
Many waiting lists were going in the wrong direction well before the pandemic.
I've been here for just over 6 months, and in that time, we've practically eliminated, as I said, last year, the number of people waiting 2 years for treatment. We've just recently practically eliminated the number of people waiting 1.5 years, and you've seen an enormous improvement in A&E and ambulance waiting times.
In January,
if you look, Ken, actually Laura Kuenssberg is correct yet again in pulling him up on the facts. The NHS waiting times were increasing all the way through the austerity period, and also we have. I mean, look at this. You can even see. Look, it's going down during the new Labour period, and as soon as the Conservative comes in, it starts rising. It's continuing to rise to the point that it is similar to what it is now. Obviously, we're at record levels too. But the idea that this was just something to do with the pandemic and not indeed 15 years of underfunding of the NHS, so he's just lying through his teeth. Well, to be fair to Rishi Sunak, he did say he's only had 6 months himself, and yet again, this is something that you can deliberately blame on David Cameron. Right? David Cameron is 100% to blame for all of this stuff. But you can't really then forgive Rishi Sunak for what's happening now, given that his platform, him and Jeremy Hunt's platform, is more austerity. The idea that, you know, you can then... Rishi gets away with it because it was David Cameron's fault and he's promising the same things that's going to lead to the same results and the same continuing failure. It's almost like they are deliberately trying to make it fail because they want it to fail, because they want to privatise it. Who knows? Just spitballing here. It potentially might be what their plan is.
And I said very transparently and clearly then in January that the overall waiting list itself was not expected to start coming down until next year. But that doesn't take away from the fact that right now, the NHS, as a result of our investment and the plans that we've put in place, is treating more people than it has ever done. And so,
yes, because that's how population growth works. You must, again, obviously politicians will lie with facts all the time. It's their modus operandi. Like, whatever, fine, I get it. But do you just think we're all idiots? That's how population growth works. That's how economic growth works, right?
What we're going to do this week is something about the long term, and governments should make the right long-term decisions for the country. It has never been done before. People have always said the NHS needs a long-term plan, so we hire more doctors, more nurses, more GPs, and yes, I'm not going to, as you say, like it takes 5, 10, 15 years for these things to come through. That doesn't mean it's the wrong thing for me to do, because I'm focused.
But here's a long-term plan for the NHS for you, right? Cut out all the private providers, cut out all of the internal market shit, right? You cut out all of the agency staff and replace them with full-time internal salaried staff. And because you'll be offering them a higher wage, you'll be able to recruit more because you'll incentivize people to join. That's your long-term NHS plan, and neither party is offering it.
Why should anybody have faith that it will work when right now you can't even reach agreements with junior doctors or nurses to keep them in work? And we know so many staff are leaving the NHS, so why can we believe that your workforce plan actually will make the right kind of difference?
Well, first of all, it's not my plan, it's the NHS's plan. So it's the NHS's long-term workforce plan that I'm pleased the government will be fully supporting and backing. So that's the first thing to say. Now, you talked about pay settlements. I'm really pleased.
I'm sceptical of his claim here that this is completely independent of government intervention. The NHS might have its own workforce plan, but at the end of the day, the government is the people, and the chancellor is the people who have the purse strings on what nurses and doctors can be paid. And if they don't get paid more, you won't recruit them. It's no more difficult than that, right? If you don't pay them more, you won't be able to recruit them unless you conscript them. That's it. You can throw numbers and statistics at me all you want, right? But that is the brass tacks. This simple fact cannot be changed. Is this some kind of plausible deniability thing for when it all goes to shit? I feel like it's being deliberate plausible deniability so that they can justify the privatisation of it, right? Because if the NHS workforce plan fails, and that leads to the collapse of the NHS, they can blame the NHS specifically as to why it's failed. Like, you had this workforce plan, you were the one who failed it, and now we have to privatise it, we have no choice. In the same way that when Margaret Thatcher got the regional water boards privatised, she made it so that they couldn't hire private capital to be able to engage in investment. And then when the new rules about water quality came in from the European Union, they physically could not afford to upgrade their systems, and so had to be privatised. But had to, only because of the strict rules that have been placed upon them by the state. So the water boards technically failed, but they failed because the scope of what they could do to deal with the problems was being hamstrung by the government, which is the same as what's happening now. It's actually a very convenient parallel in the way that governments will set specific limitations, let the devolved part of government work only within those limitations, and when they fail to deliver on their mandate, they justify it as a way of extricating it to the private sector. When, of course, the real reason for the failure is the government intervention, not the body itself being a public body, if you see what I mean.
Right, I have to make difficult decisions as Prime Minister. Everyone can see the context that we're in with inflation and interest rates. Now, I want to prioritise the things that are right for the country. So yes, we're investing in the long-term workforce plan. When it comes to public sector pay, I'm going to do what I think is affordable, what I think is responsible.
It literally is just thoughts and prayers. It's just, the NHS have got all the scope they can do. Look at the agreements that we've made. It's up to them to be able to fix this. I'm giving my thoughts and prayers for the future of the NHS, though, Fingers crossed, guys, I know you can do it. It's identical to Rishi Sunak's advice on the mortgage crisis, which is like, we'll get through this. I'm on it, folks. We're on it. Enjoy your mortgage rate rises, folks. I believe in you. I have faith. Blitz spirit. Let's go.
Because lots of our viewers are desperately worried about interest rates. Now, the point of jacking up interest rates is to make it more expensive to borrow, and therefore that means that people will have less money to spend. And it means that people watching this right now are going to hurt. They're going to have less cash to go around. Do you admit that it will be painful for many, many people?
Of course I know that it's a challenging time, and that's why 2 years ago I started talking about the danger of inflation. And that's why earlier this year when I set out my 5 priorities, what's the first of those? to halve inflation.
I'm asking you a different question there.
Yeah, and inflation is going up, right? Clearly, this backing the Bank of England's Treasury rate rises on the interest rate isn't working. Again, even if they were working, they're not going to work immediately. They're not going to work as quickly as people would expect them to be able to work. But of course, a lot of the inflation, as I said, is due to increase in input costs, which, of course, changing in demand is not going to change that at all. The margins will stay the same, right? The margins will still be identical if the input costs goes up and the output costs go up. It just means people will be able to buy fewer things. This engineering a recession to get inflation down is only going to immiserate people. It's not going to fix the issue.
And it might be hard to say to people, but I think people look to their Prime Minister for candour and to tell them hard things. Do you admit that there's going to be a lot of financial pain for many, many people? And is it worth it in order to get inflation down?
Inflation, Laura, is the thing that causes people financial pain. Inflation is the enemy. Why? Because inflation eats the pound in your pocket. It makes your paycheck go less far.
Of course, he is right in what he's about to say, in that inflation eats into your savings. But of course, what savings? Who in the working class has savings? One of the main reasons why you would want to increase the interest rate, the overall base rate from the Bank of England, is to get people a better return on their savings, to incentivise them to go and save. But why would anyone save when people have no discretionary income because of the cost of living crisis? So many necessities have been marketised to the point at which that we are being price gouged by inelastic demand markets, where profiteers can essentially hold us to ransom because we can't not pay for things like energy and housing and water, etc., etc. We don't have the choice to go and save money to bring demand down to cool inflation when we have to spend every single penny that we have.
It eats into your savings, it pushes up prices, it puts at risk jobs and livelihoods. Inflation is the enemy that we need to conquer.
But interest rates going up are also an enemy for many people watching this.
Interest rates are a consequence of high inflation. And I think we should be very clear about what is doing damage to people, what is causing people challenges in their day-to-day living and their budgeting is inflation.
The irony, Jim Speak, is that his plan isn't to close your eyes and think of Britain to get inflation down, because he actually believes that the Bank of England's rate rise is good at bringing down inflation. They think that their fiscal restraint is good at bringing down inflation. And in a time of cost-push inflation, that's not the case. That fundamentally is not the case with the kind of inflation that we are seeing now. That really isn't actually the case. That's my approach to inflation, which is we have seen an increase in input costs. The economy has to readjust. That's it. That's all. That's my approach to this inflationary crisis, and the continued immiseration through both fiscal and monetary policy is not going to help bring this down. It's just going to make life worse for everyday people.
So you are prepared to see rates continue to rise in order to squeeze inflation. That's what you're saying. But do you admit that that is going to hurt for a lot of people? We're inundated with emails saying their mortgage is going to double. We're inundated with people saying that they can't afford their rent. We're inundated with emails from people saying they're just not going to be able to afford it on top of everything else that's gone up. Now, it might be the right thing to do. You said you're prepared to say it, but do you admit it's going to hurt?
So, first of all, with interest rates, yes, they're going up in the UK, and I fully support the Bank of England in their actions. They're also going up in almost all other countries. If you look at interest rates in Australia, in America, in Canada, in New Zealand, all very similar rates to here in the UK. Rates in Europe at the highest they've been for 20 years. So we're not alone in facing this challenge. Central banks across the world are taking very similar action.
But do you think that's a comfort for people?
But let me talk.
That sounds a bit like you're
no, but I'm putting
reading
it in context. But no, I'm putting it in context. It's important, actually. You talked about me as Prime Minister. Part of my job is to explain to people what is happening with the economy, the context that we're in. It's right for people to know that's the global macroeconomic context. But let's go to the individual person. What are we doing to help? Because of course, when someone sees their mortgage rate go up, that is going to have an impact on their family finances. Of course it is. And that's why we're putting support in place to help people. Just this week, the Chancellor sat down with the banks to put in place a series of measures that people can draw on. Now, we have the welfare system. There's a support for mortgage interest scheme for people who are particularly vulnerable. But for others, they can now talk to their bank. They can request an extension to their mortgage or a switch to an interest-only mortgage. None of that will have an impact on their credit rating, and it will save them potentially hundreds of pounds a month on their mortgage payments.
But if you're because the logic for interest rate rises to cool inflation is that by making people pay more for interest on their credit, that will reduce their consumptive power, therefore reducing demand and bringing demand down closer to supply to be able to cool inflation. But if you're just going to let people move to interest rate only mortgages, then that means that they will still have the same consumptive power as they had before, as they're not going to see the increase in their overall payments on their credit because of the base rate rise. So if you're going to give them the opportunity to move so that they still have the same spending power they had before the rate rise, then by your own internal logic, Rishi, the methods that you're taking to be able to make sure people don't have to be hit as hard by the rate rise are going to nullify the effect of the rate rise on inflation. None of this makes any sense. The only thing that makes real sense is if Rishi Sunak is basically only doing whatever is best for the banks, because the banks actually get more money by the interest rate rises, because that's where all of those interest payments are going to the banks. They make more profit off of higher interest rates on the credit they've already passed out in mortgages, for example. And so by taking, I know, a 6-month period where you move to interest only, that's an extra 6 months of interest that you're paying, which is extending your mortgage by 6 months because you're therefore not making repayments. So you've added on 6 months worth of interest onto the cost of the rest of your mortgage, thereby giving the bank way more profit. The only thing that makes sense, given what we know about Rishi's approach to macroeconomic policy to be able to cool inflation, means that the only reason he's doing any of this is to ensure that the banks make as much profit as possible. Because, of course, this is a guy who has a career being involved with the banking sector in 2008, no less. It was in Goldman Sachs, if I remember correctly, or was it Deutsche Bank? I forget which one it was. This guy who is literally a career in banking. These are all his mates. So of course he's going to make sure that he engages in the actual fiscal policy that is going to be the most beneficial to the banking sector, because these are all his fucking mates.
Have already been going up. Core inflation is not coming down. And the wealthy who've already paid their houses off are going to see interest rates go up on their savings pot. And ordinary families who think they've done the right thing, they've saved, they've managed to get onto the property ladder, they're the people that are going to suffer here. Isn't there an alternative, or is it your belief that there is no alternative to this?
No, there isn't an alternative to stamping out inflation,
But is
and
there
that
an
does
alternative
require
to putting up interest rates?
That is one component of what we need to do to tackle inflation. That's what the Bank of England's responsibility is. And it's right that you asked me. My responsibility is also there, and that's to manage the government's borrowing responsibly. Because if I make the wrong decisions, if we end up borrowing too much money, and we talked about public sector pay earlier being a good example of that, if I make the wrong decisions, borrow too much money, that will put further fuel on the fire of the inflation challenge.
It won't, though, because we don't have demand-driven inflation. And again, this entirely counteracts what he was saying before. He is literally in making sure that the policy that's being used to cool inflation gets negated by what he is doing with regards to the potential to move on to interest-only mortgages, right? He is literally instituting a policy which will continue to increase demand at the behest of the rate rises of the Bank of England. So for him saying, well, actually, no, it's fine to be able to protect mortgage holders by ensuring that they pay more money to the banks, but also don't have their house repossessed. But also we can't make sure that nurses and doctors and teachers and firefighters are paid at a higher rate based upon, the union dispute. He's absolutely fine to ensure that inflation can get cooled by protecting mortgage holders. Well, inflation won't get cooled, sorry. The inflation will be, quote-unquote, adding fuel to the fire with regards to mortgage holders. But he was very happy to ensure that there is no fuel added to the fire when it comes to working-class people on the front line working for the public sector who've had pay under inflation for 15 years and, in fact, were earning more, as purchasing power is concerned, in 2005 than they were now. So none of this makes any sense. It makes no sense at all, unless, of course, you know full well, as I do, as a leftist, that Rishi Sunak has two priorities: immiserate the working class, make sure the bank makes loads of money. Which is the only thing that makes sense.
And will just mean inflation is going to be here for longer, be worse, and interest rates will be higher for longer. Now, so that's my responsibility to get right, is government borrowing. And that's why I have to take what are difficult and oftentimes not popular decisions, but they're the right long-term decisions for the country. I'm not going to shy away from that. I spent all of last summer talking about this. I talked about it as Chancellor, and as Prime Minister, I'm going to do the things that will ultimately benefit country and all the families that you talked about in the long term. Because there is no point, Laura, in me doing something that sounds popular and nice today. For example, on public sector pay, I would be giving with one hand and we would just be taking with the other through higher inflation and interest rates. That's not the right type of leadership that the...
Except that's what you're doing with mortgages. That's literally what you're doing with mortgages. This is complete disunity of message.
Country needs, and that's not what I'm going to do.
But this week you've told people that it's going to be okay. Do you understand why people looking at their mortgage bills, looking at their shopping bill, worrying about keeping a roof over their heads, are going to listen to you and think, it's not going to be okay for me? Doesn't it sound to many people, or might it risk sounding like you're in some kind of parallel universe where the NHS is getting better and the economy is going to be okay? That's not the experience of millions of people right now.
I've never said that it's not challenging. I've never said that this isn't going to be a difficult time to get through, but what I want to give people the reassurance and confidence is that we've got a plan, the plan will work, and we will get through this. That's exactly what people should be hearing from their Prime Minister and their government, particularly from me, given that this particular issue is one that I've talked about for a while. I deliberately made it the first of my 5 priorities, so no one can say this is not something that I'm not aware of, not on top of, and people should have the reassurance that the plans that we've got are the right ones, because they will bring inflation down over time.
The issue is that there is, as I've said on the segment I made on this particular subject before, there is a singular solution to inflation at the moment. There's a singular solution, and that is increasing supply. We have to increase the supply of goods and services in the economy. We have to increase the supply. And the first thing you have to do is you have to deal with the issues of Brexit. You have to deal with the issue of the increase in tariff costs that's pushing up input costs across the economy. For example, you have to have a proper industrial strategy to get people into jobs that create more supply, domestic supply in the economy that don't rely on imports, for example, because our current account is already too low as it is. Our current account deficit, rather, is already too high, I guess, sorry. And you have to inject state money into ensuring that there's an increase in supply of the things we already have a dearth of supply of, which is, of course, energy and homes, right? The 2 big ones, energy, homes, and food. Those are the 3 things we need to increase the supply of. And the fact that we have both parties saying that we need to cut government investment into the economy, when all of the problems that we have right now are literally a result of the issues of 15 years of state underinvestment in the economy. And both parties are saying we have to control the purse strings, we can't increase fiscal support. And I'm like, we've had 15 years of no fiscal support. And this is why we're in the problems right now. And you're saying, well, if we just do more of the same, we're going to fix all the issues. Nonsense. It's complete nonsense. It's lunacy.
Do you think the Governor of the Bank of England has done a good job?
I think the Bank of England's track record, including the Governor's track record, over a long period of time has been that inflation has been managed appropriately, and people should have the confidence that inflation will fall back to target as it is.
Not all of your colleagues think he's done a good job.
I can tell you as Prime Minister, the Bank of England is doing the right thing. The Bank of England...
It literally is zombie neoliberal thinking. Literally just zombies completely acting regardless of any external stimuli. Just continuing along with the same old dogma that's continually failed and expecting that if they continue to do the same thing, it'll eventually work, right? You know, come and dig up, stupid, is the meme that comes to mind. Because none of this is being successful. I think people pointing out in chat, right, that we have this danger with an increase in rates that will help fuel inflation, given that our change to a kind of debt-driven economy, especially when it turns, for example, to business costs are incredibly based upon huge amounts of private debt, which will obviously, the rates on that will increase on what they have to pay for the credit that they've started their business on, will mean that to be able to maintain their current profit margins, they have to be able to increase their inputs, which involve increasing prices. So there are issues with this idea that interest rates even have an ability to cool demand in the first place.
Has my total support. Inflation is the enemy for all the reasons that we've talked about. Inflation is what makes people poorer. That's why I prioritised tackling it as the #1 thing that I said in January. And now look, that means difficult things. I could sit here and tell you we could wish it all away, that there was some easy overnight fix. We didn't have to put up interest rates, unlike every other country. I could pay everybody exactly what they wanted. We could spend on everything that we wanted, borrow without abandon. I would not be...
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice that I am willing to make. Exactly, literally saying, I know you want to get paid more, but tough. Workers, it's your fault that the inflation is here. Not allowed a pay rise. Profits can continue to be at record highs. We can still have as many more billionaires than we've ever had in this country, right? But Johnny come lately, expecting to have an extra pay rise when he's already, 10% below the last kind of year and a half worth of inflationary figures. Tough shit, mate. You have to watch your earnings fall, your purchasing power fall. Private equity firms investing in the property that's continually increased as a result of Conservative Party policy to deliberately engineer increasing house prices to get economic growth out of nowhere. John Doe, not allowed to. Not allowed a pay rise. Absolutely out of the question.
Being honest with the country if I said that. That's not leadership. Now, yes, are things challenging? Yes, does that mean I have to make some difficult decisions as Prime Minister? Of course it does. But those are the right decisions for the long-term benefit of our country. Look, I didn't get into this to do easy things. I didn't get in this for the short-term opinion polls and all the rest of it. I get that this is challenging and that's going to have an impact on me in the short term, but we've got to stick to the cause, and I want people to be reassured that we've got to hold our nerve, stick to the plan, and we will get through this.
And I just finally want to...
You reassured, chat? I'm certainly feeling reassured. Are you reassured at home, or future YouTube viewers? If you're reassured, please leave your messages of reassurance in the comment section.
The choice of the next election is between me and Keir Starmer. Actually, what I demonstrated by resigning from Boris Johnson's government was that I was prepared to stand up for my principles. Keir Starmer sat there for 4 years next to Jeremy Corbyn saying that he was the right person.
Jumbly crumbles! We got the fucking bingo card, everybody. We got the jumbly crumbles. We got there eventually, right?
Right, that speaks to his principles. My resignation speaks to mine. We've been talking about inflation. Important and absolutely right. What's the alternative on offer from the Labour Party? £28 billion a year of more borrowing. That would push up inflation and interest rates.
No, it wouldn't. You'd be, because they're spending the money. They're not even spending the money anymore, which is the fucking stupid part. They've given up on this pledge to be able to hit their fucking fiscal rules. There was the one good pledge that they had, which would actually have brought down inflation, because they were deliberately spending this money on increasing supply of commodities in the economy. Oh my god, fucking hell! I'm just, no journalist has pushed back on this. Every journalist has gone with, oh, you can't spend this money, it's going to bring up inflation. That's what increasing supply is supposed to be there. Inflation happens when demand outstrips supply. At a point at which, the supply is being weakened because the input costs are too high, you have to increase the supply somehow. You can't just expect supply to increase out of nowhere. You have to speculate to accumulate. You have to spend money on investment to increase the supply. That's why the supply is so low, because of a massive categorical lack of investment. That's the one good thing Labour were doing, and they've now turned away from it. And no journalist in the country will even take a positive position on the idea of additional fiscal expansion with regards to new investment. And this is an internal problem the BBC knows that they have, because they did an investigation into their own journalists on their own economic credibility, and they explicitly said that their own journalists know fuck all about economics. That's a literally internal BBC report showing their own journalists don't know how economics works, to the point at which they literally are trained as part of their journalistic education when they come into the BBC to treat all fiscal expansion as bad. Why do you think that after 15 years of no investment, 15 years of austerity, 15 years of we can't spend additional money, it's profligate for a government to spend extra money, do you have an entire population who believes this wholeheartedly? Is because the media specifically only has this viewpoint, even though it's fundamentally not correct. It's fundamentally wrong. We had, the period of the post-war consensus from 1945 to 1979 that you can spend money to make money, you can speculate to accumulate. This is how literal businesses function in the economy. They spend money to make money, right? That's how businesses function. They borrow money, they invest it, they increase supply, create commodities, and they make profits off the back of it, for example. That's how any business would work. Yet when it's a government doing it, we can't spend extra money to speculate to accumulate. It's infuriating to me that was a model that worked. And we had higher growth from the period of 1945 to 1979 overall than we have had in the neoliberal period. The Keynesian post-war economic consensus, that worked to give us economic growth, to keep people's standards of living higher. Has that worked since 1979? Has it fuck? Has it? It's not worked at all. And this is the BBC literally talking about themselves, that their own journalists are myopic on their own economic viewpoints, their own economic outlook. And they've trained the public to see this as to see fiscal expansion as bad when it's fundamentally a good thing.
Not exploiting our energy reserves here at home, that's not the right sensible thing to do in the midst of an energy crisis. And giving in to unions' unaffordable pay demands, that would be inflationary and push up interest rates. That's the choice confronting people.
No evidence for this, no evidence for that whatsoever, right? He just wants to keep people's pay down because that's his role as the custodian of the bourgeois. That's it. That's all he cares about. It's not necessarily inflationary because, again, we already have low demand because we have a cost of living crisis, right? And the pay demands are still lower than the overall rate of inflation as it has been over the last year and a half, right? The headline inflation rate has gone down. That doesn't mean prices have gone down. Prices are still 16% higher than they were a year and a half ago, for example. So people's pay rises still aren't keeping up with inflation. It's still a real terms pay cut. This is not going to increase inflation because, again, we have a supply chain issue. There is no evidence for this, and it's taken as read. It's not going to get challenged by the journalists communists at all, because they fundamentally all come from the same school of economics. They went to the same universities, the same private schools. They all know the same people. They're all mates with each other, and that's why, and basically until this point, there's been no pushback on any of this stuff at all, within the media and from the public sphere.
Right now, it's not about the past, it's about the future and who is the right person to lead this country. And everyone can see the context that we're in, and they can see that I've prioritised the right things, halving inflation, growing the economy, reducing debt, cutting waiting lists, and stopping the boats. I never said it was going to be easy. I've been doing this for 6 months, but on all of those things, we are making progress, and if we stick to the course, we will deliver for the country.
And I knew that somehow you would get your 5 pledges in there by the end, and of course the Labour Party would dispute a lot of what you've just said, but just very quickly, yes or no, do you think you're going to win the next election?
Yes, because I'm going to deliver on the things that I say. And the Labour Party can dispute all they want.
He's literally failing on all 5 of his own pledges, but yeah, go off, mate.
They want to borrow £28 billion a year. That's going to push up inflation and interest rates. They don't think that we should exploit our energy resources here at home in the midst of an energy crisis, and we should put more power in the hands of dictators like Vladimir Putin. And they also...
No, they're literally doing the opposite, right? Apart from they're not, because they've cut back on their own spending plans, right? I hate to continually defend the Labour's previous plans that they've now scrapped, but it was correct that we needed to fiscally expand to be able to increase the supply of energy and homegrown renewable energy, therefore cutting our reliance on gas, cutting our reliance on the Gulf states to be able to give us gas. And to be fair, we were always getting that from Norway anyway, rather than Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Russia or whatever it might be. People just fundamentally misunderstand how the energy market works. Gas prices are being pushed up because of the lack of overall supply. Even when Russia still had the taps on, we were still getting our gas and oil from Norway, vast majority of the time. But of course, the global wholesale price of that was lower because there was other supply other nations in Europe could be able to draw from, which was Russia. And then that all of that Russian supply, that's all being cut off. So the supply is only coming from other countries such as Norway. The supply is lower, the demand is the same, the price goes up. It's as simple as that. We're not relying on Putin. When if we change to a renewable net zero economy, we'll have to rely on no Gulf states at all because we won't need gas for our own gas-fired power plants. We would just have renewable, homegrown energy. That's the real homegrown energy that we could have if we had a climate transition to a renewable energy economy.